Now that we've learned a little bit about how to create that score and get the right score order, now I want to take a look at some individual player parts a little bit. The amount of time you put into making the parts look really nice it definitely is reflected in the performance. If your parts aren't put together in an organized way, the players just kind of don't feel like you care, even on a subliminal basis. So it's really good to spend some time organizing your parts. It's never as simple as Command P or Control P or anything like that on the computer keyboard. There's always formatting to do. So anyway, let's take a look at this. Up at the top here, you can see I've got my title, of course, and my name over here, and then the instrument name in the upper left-hand corner here. Certainly we have some information here. This is out of tempo. Here's just a marking with a fermata over it. This is just basically telling the player that there's something going on right here, but it's not for them to play. And then there's a couple measures completely out, and then there's a note that they're holding on with a fermata with a decrescendo, and then we've got tempo here in 5/4. A couple things to notice. First of all, right here at the end too, as we go back to 4/4, there's a warning at the end of the measure that tells the player we're going back to 4/4 on the next line. Okay, but the other thing I want you to notice is the symmetry here. The overall idea here is to make it easy for the players to sight read, even difficult music. My thinking is always that there's never enough time to rehearse, and uh, time is money, especially when you're in the studio. So you really want to write out the part in such a way that they can easily figure out what's going on without trying to decipher notes and things. Now this paper that you're looking at that this is on is 8.5 by 11-inch letter size paper. And so that's actually smaller than the paper that we used to use when we did this all by hand. That paper was 9.5 by 12.5. So it's a little bit bigger and does make a big difference. So we want to be careful about how much we put on each page in terms of systems and measures, and we want to be careful of the spacing as well. So by symmetry, notice that I've got double bar lines at the end of, or should I say on the right-hand side of the systems, wherever I possibly can. Now here's an exception to that, but I'll talk about that in a moment. But the overall idea is to get the double bar line on the far right-hand side of the page and get the beginnings of sections, that's where these rehearsal numbers are at the left-hand side. I've boxed in the beginning of sections. Now, in this case, measure 14. That's the beginning of a section. Measure 22, the beginning of a section. Measure 30, the beginning of a section, etc. Now, the reason why this 46 is in here is because you can see that between this 6-bar rest, multi-measure rest, this measure here, and then going to 6/4, would have been a lot of information to put on one page to be able to easily read. And so I decided to split that up a little bit, but then as soon as you can, you get back to the idea of looking consistent, and you've got your double bar lines on the right-hand side where you can. Up here in this line here, I was able to put 7-measure rest and then notes. So that's 8 measures covered right there. I put a 8-measure multi-measure rest on one line. I could have just as easily put this information, this system, and this system all on one line, and that would have been legitimate and that would have been fine. But I decided to really open up the part a little bit and, again, try to make it a little bit easier for the player to read. The overall idea with these rehearsal numbers is that it used to be done, especially with live bands and things. This would be letter A, this would be letter B, this would be letter C, D, you know, E, and just go right through the alphabet. But when you've got situations where you're dealing with the computer in the recording studio, you might be working with a sequence, and recording live players at the same time, it's easier for the engineer and the players to be speaking the same language, which is numbers. The computer reads numbers, it doesn't read letters. So that seems to make a little more sense. Now, the measure numbers that are in between these beginnings of big sections, like this 6 right here, this just refers to measure 6, and there are no other measure numbers on the rest of the line, just the beginning of the line. So if you remember on the score pages when we were working with the scores, the measure numbers were on every single measure at the bottom. When it comes to player parts, on the other hand, we will put the measure numbers, I put them pretty much underneath the clef to stay out of the way, but you'll put those measure numbers on the beginning of every system, with the exception of when you've got a big rehearsal number like this, then you don't have to be redundant and put the 14 also down there. All right, now this is the flute part. Lots of articulation, slurs and things where necessary to show the players where the phrases are. We can move to the next page here. And I've also put down some notes for the player to kind of keep track of where they are. So at 81 here, you'll notice I've written in violin 2 free area. There was a violinist, or actually 2 violinists in this particular piece, and the number 2 violin has got a section here where it's really open and the player's playing totally freely, and some really nice playing actually. And but as far as the flute player goes, it's a rest with a fermata over it, so it's very open. And then when we come back to tempo, or a tempo, we're at 82, and I'm calling that on cue, which means that on cue from myself or the conductor, in this case myself though, we are back here, and so we can start counting again. And then there's some notes finally for the player to play, etc. Okay, and that continues up to measure 117 right here, where there's now a cello free area. Same thing as the violin 2 free area. This is a resting spot for the flute, but the cello is going to play an improvised solo in here. And then after that, we're continuing on with this quarter note equals 123 here, so the tempo is happening right here. Now this continues along until the end. Okay, so we're at the beginning there, and this is at the very last page. Okay. Now, the next part here, we'll kind of look at a piano part next here, and you'll see a lot of similarities between this part and the part we just looked at, and that is essentially that I'm trying to still get these double bar lines on the right hand side of the page as much as possible, and the beginnings of sections over here on the left hand side of the page. In this case, this is a single staff piano part. Notice that it's not a grand staff. You can always create a piano part single staff if there's no bass parts that you want played with the left hand, or no specific voicings that need a bass clef, or another clef for that matter. In this case then, it's all, as you'll see, it's all single line, no left hand indications at all for the player. So we have chord symbols. In this case, it's a rubato or out of tempo intro, and the piano's actually not just exactly playing these notes. You'll notice on the recording that the pianist is really being quite flexible with these rhythms and very expressive, which is exactly what I wanted. But I've got the chord symbols there and the basic melody for them to follow. At 15 here, we're going into this samba or a double time feel. So the quarter note's the same as it was up here in this section, but it's the feel, the drums primarily and the bass are playing this double time kind of feel. And then we're back to this groove here, which is called a samba canção, or a slow samba, and that's the groove that we also start with. Okay, now moving along then, we can see key chord symbols and slashes, and that just all continues along. A few notes more here I want the player to play. So they're comping quite a bit of the time. Rhythmic figures for how I want them to play this chord symbol here. And then here's some two-handed octaves that I want the player to play going into a voicing here. This happens to be with the horns, as you'll hear on the score. And then this continues, so all chord symbols, so this is pretty easy. At 93, we've got a piano solo that starts. And I even tell the player where to end. And we're back to these rhythmic figures again. Here I've actually got some notes, actual voicings to be played. And that continues back to the samba canção, back to the double time feel, some more voicings that are kind of interesting sounding, fourths basically. And then that continues along all through here. And I've got quarter note triplets here, and notice the articulation over them, and they're playing with the synth here. The synth is playing a mallet sound at this point in the arrangement, and the piano is playing these octaves along with it at that time. Big molto retard, a great big retard, and then the very last chord here. Okay, so that's a single staff piano part, but of course we can also have a more traditional kind of part where we've got a grand staff. And in this case, where I've got notes that are definitely down in the bass clef, I've got very specific voicings I want, then I've got to write out the notes. There's no chord symbols that will really work for me in these kinds of situations. And even if I could come up with a chord symbol, it wouldn't say anything about the voicing. So when you have to write out notes because a voicing demands it, there's no chord symbol that'll work with it, then you have to use the actual notes. So again, we're trying to get the right-hand side to be where sections end, the left-hand side to be where sections begin. And dynamic markings and tempo markings, right? Slashes. What this means in here, these slashes just mean to the player to take this voicing and comp essentially with that voicing. Again, there's no real chord symbol that I'm thinking about. Same thing here. We have a voicing that I want exactly played this way, but the player can actually use rhythms that they want here, that they feel will work given what the rest of the band is doing. All right, and then that just kind of continues. Now this is an open solo area. And what this means is, now this is the synth, not the piano, but this is going around and around and around, just repeating, repeating, and repeating until I, in this case, cue the band to keep moving on now to 51. So in fact, it says on cue, and we're back to 180, which is actually double time from the original tempo. And that continues until we get to measure 63 here. Now it's time for a guitar solo, and they're going to do the same thing. They're going to go, the guitarist is going to go round and round and round and round here with the rest of the band, and then upon my cue, we're moving to 67 here. Again, this double time swing, 180. And then we're going to DS back to the sign and finish out the tune. Now, another part is a drum part. A couple things to notice here is that in general, we've got what the hands are doing stems up, and what the feet are doing, or the kick drum in this case, is stems down. We've got a swing 16th funk groove, tempo of 95. And notice how I've written solo around this groove. So this is a pretty simple straight ahead funk groove, but I don't want the player to literally stay with that exactly. I don't want them to, change the groove radically or anything, but I certainly do want them to be able to feel free about playing. The drummer on this track was Casey Sherrill, and he's just a wonderful player, and he did open this up quite a bit. But this gives them an idea of what I'm looking for. And we have slashes. Now, these numbers here, 4 and 6, just tell the player that at this point, you've done 4 more measures, and here 6, and that just makes it easier for the player so that they don't have to literally count every single one of these measures. You can see here with the 3, this is measure number 3, measure number 9, measure number 13, etc. Here's some rhythmic notation that we also call stop time when it comes to drums especially, but the idea being is that pretty much everybody in the band is playing this rhythm right here. It's up to the drummer just how they want to accent, but you can see with the forte dynamic marking that they should definitely use at least a kick, maybe a snare, and perhaps even cymbals there. And then we're back to this mezzo forte groove at A. Now, this part was actually done a while ago, and this was totally live. There was no studio work at all done with this. And so in this case, I actually used letters to name the sections, and this was done actually 10 or 12 years ago anyway. So it was before I adopted the current rehearsal number strategy that I use today. So we've got A. This is where the first melody starts at letter A. Here's letter B, where the second melody starts. Now here, notice that I've changed up not only the groove of the drums, but I've also changed up the way that I'm thinking about the kick and snare relationship. Because if we go back up to the top of the page here, you can see that I've got kick going stems down, snare, and everything else going stems up. But down here, I've actually put the kick and the snare together. And I did this because from talking with drummers, they felt that this would, for this particular groove here, they felt this would be easier for the drummer to understand what I want. Because I've got quarter notes on the bell of the cymbal. And I've even said ad lib so the player can kind of improvise on that a bit. And then we've got this ending here. And there's a fill going into this right here. And then they come back to this repeat here and continue to the second ending. Okay, and that continues. So I've got a lot of spots where there's kicks over time notation in the drums. That works great after you've established the groove. Kicks over time, and notice that I do have the rests in place as well. This is also where the fine will be at the very ending. I've got some more directions for the player. This is where a synth solo happens. At letter E is where there's a saxophone entrance. These are all just really helpful things for the drummer. Notice that I've got the kick drum part in here, but slashes again up in the hands essentially, and that's for the player to improvise with, but I want this definite kick drum part to be happening. Okay. And then we get toward the ending of the tune here, and more of that change of groove. There's a brass entrance right there. Then we're going to DS and then go back. All right, so then finally, another part that I've got here for us that really kind of brings up some interesting things is this guitar part here. This part has a combination of things. As you can see, there's notes for the player to play. Right? And if we go on to another page here, there's chord symbols as well. Some very definite parts here. And notice up here at 55 and at 39 that I've told the guitarist with soprano. That way the guitarist knows when they're playing this melody that they're listening for the soprano sax. And they are going to phrase together. They'll listen to each other. And they'll even try to match each other's vibrato, which is really important because you wouldn't want, say, the soprano sax playing one kind of vibrato, and so maybe a fast vibrato, while the guitar is playing a slower vibrato. It's better if they actually match it together and sound like one instrument, because that's exactly what I wanted from them as well. All right, and then just chord symbols, more notes, a few more lines. I've even got some top note voicings right here. So top note voicings just simply mean that the player is taking your top note and then voicing, in this case, an E flat major 7 flat 5 below it. Same thing. It actually started right here, actually. All right, then there's a solo section for the guitar. I've got chord symbols there. And again, that's an open solo like one of the other tunes we looked at. And then we're on cue. I'm going to move to this section. All right, then we move down here. We've got a DS al fine, so we go back to the segno sign and end at the fine. All right. Now, finally, I do have this one other part here, and it is the on a song called "Innocent Wonder" that I believe you have the score for there. And what this is, it's an alto sax player that also plays flute, and so that's called doubling. And so I want the player to play both on this. And that's a common practice, really, for alto players, although you should check with them to make sure that they do, in fact, play flute also. But at the beginning here, I'm mentioning that I want them to start on alto. Okay, so they're going to play this line on alto sax, and then they're going to move to flute. Now, alto sax, as you know, is a transposing instrument. That's up a major sixth from concert pitch. So the concert key is C for this particular piece. So the alto sax is starting in the key of A and reading in the key of A, I should say. But flute is a non-transposing instrument. It's a C instrument, as they say. So we have to change back the key signature so that when the flute plays these notes, they actually sound correct. And that goes for a little while. And then we have a 4-bar rest here, and I want the player to go back to the alto sax. So 4 measures is just about enough time to be able to put the flute down real quick and pick up the alto, which is strapped around their neck, and get the reed wet, and away we go here. But notice we do change the key signature back to what it was originally, because that would make the notes sound correct when they're played. And that continues. Okay, all through here, all through here. And then after all of that, we're going to go back to flute here. Okay, so the key signature has been changed again, back to C. The player's out for essentially 9 measures, and then they play these notes. Right? Now, a multi-measure rest can't go through a double bar line, and that's why you actually see 8 here, plus this measure here. Logic would tell you, well, why not make it a 9-measure rest? And the reason, again, is because of the double bar line. You can't put a multi-measure rest through a double bar line. And then the player plays that, and then we're back here, and we're going to go back to alto sax again. And so the player, we have to change the key signature again. Player goes back to the alto sax, plays all of these notes, actually takes a solo. I figure for all the trouble that the person's gone through, the least I can do is give them a solo. And notice that the chord symbols are moved up a whole major sixth as well. Okay, that's important. And then we finish it out. It's going to finish out on soprano sax and a big molto retard there, and then these notes. Now, the other thing to notice too is that if I back up just a page for a second, I've got the alto playing a solo through here, but notice these rhythms. This isn't what I want the alto sax player to play. I don't want the player to play rhythms, but I wanted the player to know what the horn rhythms are that are behind him. So this is the essential part of what's going on rhythmically. So the player can decide to play in these holes, you know, where these rests are if he wants, or he can play over the top of the whole thing. Okay, and so that's it on our parts. Each part takes a real lot of thought as to how you want to organize it, but I guarantee you that if you take the time to organize it in a systematic way, as I have here, the players will definitely respect that. And that really comes in handy, especially when you don't know who the players are that you're going to be working with. You're often going to sessions where you don't know literally every single person on the session. And so if your music looks really good, then psychologically people pay attention to that right away. And, you know, maybe the music isn't even any good, but the players will try, as opposed to bringing in really sloppily put together parts. And the music might be really, really good, but if the players can't read it very well, then they're going to have a hard time performing it for you very well. And psychologically, you know, they're not going to try, because it looks like to them like you didn't try to make things easy for them either. So that's it on parts. But make sure you ask if you've got any questions about this.